There are places in this world where the fabric of reality is worn thin by the weight of suffering. Places where the soil itself has drunk so much blood that it refuses to let history sleep. We often look at history books as flat, two-dimensional records of dates and political maneuvers. But we forget that every date marked in red was a day where a human heart raced in terror, where lungs gasped for one last breath of damp, fog-choked air, and where the mind shattered under the pressure of impending doom. Welcome to Nocturnal Ledger. Today, we are not merely recounting a ghost story. We are opening the archives of the most blood-soaked square mile in the United Kingdom. We are walking through the stone gates of a fortress that has stood for nearly 1,000 years as a monument to fear, control, and death. We are entering Her Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress of the Tower of London. This is a true story documented in historical records, military logs, and the sworn testimonies of those who were never prone to flights of fancy. The horror here is not a campfire tale. It is a legacy carved into the limestone and granite by the fingernails of the condemned. To truly understand the haunting of the tower, we must first understand its intent. When William the Conqueror began construction of the White Tower in the year 1078, it was not designed to be a residence of comfort. It was a statement of domination. It was built to loom over the citizens of London, a terrifying reminder of the new Norman power. The very mortar used to bind these stones was mixed with the sweat of oppressed laborers. And historically, the intent was to intimidate. Over the centuries, that intimidation evolved into incarceration, torture, and execution. The atmosphere within these walls has been curated for nearly a millennium to induce despair. When you step onto the grounds today, amidst the chatter of tourists, it is easy to forget that for centuries, entering this place was often a one-way journey. But when the sun sets and the gates are locked, the modern world recedes. And the yeoman warders, the famous bee-feeders who live within the walls, will tell you that the past does not merely echo here. It screams. One of the most clinically documented phenomena in the tower concerns the tragic fate of Queen Anne Boleyn. Her story is well known to historians, but the paranormal record associated with her execution is one of the most consistent and terrifying in British history. We must look at the specific details of her death to understand the nature of her haunting. On May 19th, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold erected on Tower Green. Unlike many others who faced the clumsy axe of a local headsman, Anne was granted the mercy of a swordsman from Calais, a master of the blade who could sever the head with a single, clean strike. Historical records state that she was terrified, yet composed, her eyes darting frantically around the courtyard, perhaps hoping for a last-minute reprieve from her husband, King Henry VIII. That reprieve never came. The sword fell. But energy, as physics tells us, is neither created nor destroyed. The sheer psychic trauma of a queen, the anointed by God, being publicly slaughtered, appears to have imprinted itself upon the atomic structure of the location. The most chilling evidence of her restless spirit comes not from folklore, but from military court-martial records from the 19th century. In 1864, a captain of the guard was making his rounds when he found a sentry standing guard near the lieutenant's lodgings, a building where Anne had spent her final days. The sentry was not at his post. He was lying on the ground, unconscious. When he was revived, he was terrified, shaking violently. He was immediately court-martialed for sleeping on duty, a severe offense that could result in brutal punishment. During his trial, the soldier gave a sworn testimony that silenced the room. He claimed that while standing guard in the dead of night, he saw a white figure emerge from the mist. It was a woman dressed in archaic clothing, drifting toward him. He issued the standard military challenge, demanding the figure halt and identify itself. The figure ignored him and continued to advance. The soldier, following protocol, charged the intruder with his bayonet. But instead of striking flesh and bone, the steel weapon passed through the figure as if it were smoke. A sudden, freezing shockwave hit him, and he saw fire flash along the barrel of his rifle before he collapsed. This could have been dismissed as the excuse of a lazy soldier, but there was a corroborating witness. Major General J.D. Dundas, a highly respected officer, testified that from his window in the Bloody Tower, he had seen the sentry challenge the empty air and then collapse. On the court-martial records show that the soldier was acquitted. The British Army, an institution of rigid logic and discipline, officially accepted that the man had encountered something unexplainable. Sightings of Anne Boleyn are often accompanied by a distinct drop in temperature and a feeling of overwhelming sorrow. She is frequently seen in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, the parish church within the tower, where her headless body was unceremoniously dumped into a narrow chest and buried beneath the flagstones. During the late 19th century, a lights-out patrol officer noticed a light burning in the locked chapel. Finding a ladder, he climbed up to peer through the high windows. His report describes a scene that defies rational explanation. He claimed to see a procession of slow-moving figures in Tudor dress pacing down the aisle, led by a woman who resembled the portraits of Anne Boleyn. But the horror lay in the details. The figures were translucent, glowing with a faint, sickly light, and they eventually faded into the stone walls. The officer was a combat veteran, a man not easily shaken, yet he refused to ever patrol near the chapel alone again. However, the tower holds tragedies far darker than the execution of a grown woman. The most heart-wrenching and perhaps the most malevolent hauntings are tied to the mystery of the princes in the tower. In 1483, 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were lodged in the tower by their uncle, the man who would become Richard III, and they were seen playing in the gardens, shooting arrows and running along the walls. Then, the sightings became less frequent. They were seen only behind the barred windows, and then they were seen no more. For centuries, their fate was a subject of dark rumor, until 1674. Workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower made a grisly discovery. Buried 10 feet deep beneath a stone foundation was a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children. The bones were examined, and the anatomy corresponded with the ages of the missing princes. The area around the Bloody Tower, where the boys were believed to have been murdered, is widely considered one of the most oppressive locations in London. Guards and visitors have reported the sound of childish giggling echoing in empty corridors. But this is not the laughter of joy. It is the nervous, stifled laughter of children trying to hide. In the mid-20th century, 2 guards were on night duty outside the Bloody Tower when they saw 2 small figures gliding down the stairs. They were holding hands, wearing white nightshirts, their faces pale and terrified. As the guards watched, frozen in disbelief, the figures backed away toward the wall and simply dissolved into the stonework. The psychological impact of this specific haunting is profound. Documented accounts from the 1990s detailed the experiences of a family visiting from the United States. They were touring the Bloody Tower when their young daughter began to scream hysterically. She was pointing at an empty corner and shouting that the boys in the nightgowns were telling her to run away because the bad man is coming. The parents saw nothing, but the child was inconsolable and had to be carried out of the fortress. She later described the boys as having purple marks on their necks, a detail she could not have known, which aligns with the historical theory that the princes were suffocated with pillows. We must also consider the scientific perspective on these phenomena. Why does the tower act as such a potent battery for the paranormal? Parapsychologists often refer to the stone tape theory. This hypothesis suggests that minerals, particularly quartz and limestone, materials abundant in the tower's construction, can record high emotional events much like a magnetic tape. When the atmospheric conditions are right, these recordings play back. This would explain the residual nature of many hauntings here, where the spirits do not seem to interact with the living, but merely repeat their final, traumatic moments. Nowhere is this theory more applicable than in the gruesome reenactment of the death of Margaret, the Countess of Salisbury. Her execution in 1541 was one of the most botched and barbaric in history. She was 67 years old, frail, yet defiant. She refused to lay her head on the block, stating she was no traitor. The executioner, an inexperienced youth, panicked. He hacked at her while she ran around the scaffold, striking her shoulders and head multiple times before finally ending her life. On the anniversary of her death, witnesses on Tower Green have reported hearing a phantom scream that chills the blood. It is not just a sound. It is a physical sensation of panic that washes over anyone standing near the site. The scene reportedly replays with horrific clarity. The sound of heavy footsteps, the swish of an axe through the air, and the sickening thud of steel hitting bone, followed by silence. This is not a ghost in the traditional sense. It is a scar in time, a wound in the universe that refuses to heal. The tower's history as a prison also contributes to the suffocating atmosphere experienced by modern visitors. The Salt Tower, used to hold Jesuits and political prisoners, is infamous for its psychic weight. One of the most terrifying documented events in the Salt Tower occurred to a yeoman warder in the 1970s. He was locking up for the night, a routine he had performed thousands of times. As he reached the bottom of the spiral staircase, a sudden, unseen force shoved him violently from behind. He stumbled, but caught himself. Thinking an intruder was hiding in the shadows, he drew his flashlight and turned. There was no one. The air temperature plummeted instantly, and he described a sensation of thick, oily hate filling the narrow stairwell. Then he felt hands, cold, distinct hands, wrap around his throat. He struggled, gasping for air, fighting an invisible assailant that was trying to strangle him. The attack ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving him gasping on the floor with visible red marks on his neck. He resigned shortly after, unwilling to step foot in the Salt Tower again. This physicality of the hauntings is what separates the Tower of London from other locations. The entities here are not merely visual. They can interact with the physical world. This brings us to the tragedy of the White Tower's galleries. In 1816, a keeper of the jewel house named Lenthal Swift witnessed a phenomenon that defies all logic. He was having dinner with his family in the Martin Tower when his wife suddenly shouted, Swifte looked up to see a cylindrical column of fluid, like a glass tube filled with bubbling, blue-white liquid, hovering in the air. The cylinder began to move around the table. Swifte, fearing for his family, threw a chair at the object. The chair passed through the apparition and hit the wall. The object then faded away. While this sounds like science fiction, Swifte was a credible man who gave a detailed account of the event to investigators of the time. However, the most disturbing aspect was the aftermath. Swifte's wife claimed the object had tried to seize her. Each time she fell into a deep depression and never fully recovered from the shock. A common thread among those who experienced the tower's darker side. We must also discuss the Guy Fawkes connection. In 1605, Fawkes was brought to the tower after the failed gunpowder plot. He was taken to the Queen's house, close to the council chamber. There, he was subjected to the rack. The torture was so severe that when he was finally taken to be executed, he could barely climb the ladder. In the rooms near where he was tortured, visitors and staff have reported an unshakable sensation of pain. It is not an emotional sadness, but a physical mirroring. People report sudden, sharp pains in their joints, or the feeling of their limbs being pulled. It is as if the agony of Fawkes and the other torture victims has soaked into the floorboards. And waiting to be felt by the sensitive. Perhaps the most famous, and certainly the most unique, historical encounter involves the royal menagerie. For centuries, the tower housed lions, bears, and exotic beasts given as gifts to the monarchy. In January of 1816, a sentry was on guard outside the jewel house. It was past midnight, the fog was thick off the Thames, and the silence was absolute. Suddenly, the sentry saw a massive shape emerge from the shadows. It was a bear, rearing up on its hind legs, its eyes glowing with a demonic light. Terrified, the sentry lunged and drove his bayonet into the beast's chest. The weapon met no resistance. The bear dissolved into the mist. The sentry fell unconscious. He was found hours later by his relief. He was transported to the infirmary, and where he woke up only long enough to recount the story to his superior officers and the medical staff. He died 2 days later. The medical report listed the cause of death as visitations of God, a euphemism for death by sheer fright. This man was a trained soldier, accustomed to the violence of the era. Yet he was literally scared to death by what he saw. This incident suggests that the hauntings in the tower are not limited to human spirits, or perhaps that the energy of the place can manifest in forms that reflect the deepest fears of the observer. The scientific community has attempted to debunk these events for decades. They point to the infrasound caused by the nearby traffic and the underground trains. Infrasound, sound waves below the frequency of human hearing, can cause feelings of unease, nausea, and even hallucinations. They argue that the drafty corridors and the electromagnetic fields generated by the old wiring could explain the cold spots and the feeling of being watched. However, these theories fail to account for the specificity of the sightings. Infrasound does not create a visual hallucination of a headless woman that is consistent across 5 centuries of witnesses. Electromagnetic fields do not leave physical strangulation marks on a guard's neck. Mass hysteria does not explain how a child in the 1990s describes the specific bruising patterns on the princes in the tower, details known only to forensic historians. The yeoman warders, the custodians of the tower, live with these realities every day. They are a unique community, living inside a fortress that doubles as a necropolis. In interviews with them reveal a pragmatic acceptance of the supernatural. One warder described an experience in the Byward Tower. He was sitting in his living quarters, watching television, when the heavy latch on his door lifted. The door swung open, and the smell of stale perfume, a scent from a bygone era, wafted in. His dog, a large German shepherd, whimpered and hid under the table. The warder simply got up, closed the door, and said, "Not tonight, thank you." This casual interaction highlights a terrifying truth. The haunting of the Tower of London is not an anomaly. It is the ecosystem. The living are merely guests in a house owned by the dead. One cannot speak of the tower without mentioning the Salt Tower's most enigmatic scratching. Carved into the stone walls are intricate graffiti left by prisoners waiting for death. Among them is a complex diagram by Hugh Draper, a sorcerer imprisoned in 1561. He claimed he could not be held by stone walls. Then, one night, he vanished. No body was found, no escape route was discovered. He simply ceased to exist within the cell. To this day, visitors touching the carvings in the Salt Tower report a tingling sensation, like an electric shock, and a sudden urge to weep. It is speculated that Draper may have succeeded in some arcane ritual, or perhaps he was consumed by the very dark forces he tried to command. The geography of the tower itself contributes to its horror. The Traitor's Gate, the water entrance from the Thames, is a gaping maw of damp stone. Prisoners brought by barge would look up at the gray sky, knowing it was likely the last time they would see the outside world as free men. The water lapping against those steps has washed away the tears of queens, saints, and spies. When the tide is high, the sound of the water echoing in the tunnel underneath St. Thomas's Tower sounds remarkably like moaning. Many visitors have reported hearing their names whispered from the shadows of the gate. A siren call from the river that has claimed so many bodies. There is also the documented case of the nameless thing that stalks the ramparts behind the Bowyer Tower. In the 1980s, a night watchman reported a shapeless black mass that seemed to roll along the top of the wall. It didn't have limbs or a face, but it possessed a palpable sense of malice. As it passed him, he was overcome with the smell of rotting flesh and sulfur. However, he described the feeling as if all the happiness had been sucked out of the world. This aligns with descriptions of shadow people reported in other highly active paranormal locations, suggesting the tower may be a portal or a gathering ground for entities that were never human to begin with. We must consider the psychological toll on the victims of the tower. Imagine the Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. She was 16 years old. From her window in the gentleman jailer's lodgings, she watched the cart carry the headless body of her husband back from Tower Hill. She knew she was next. The level of cortisol, the stress hormone, flooding her system in those final hours would have been catastrophic. When she was led to the scaffold on the green, she was blindfolded and panicked, groping for the block, crying out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" That moment of blind, helpless terror is etched into the location. Witnesses have reported hearing a young girl's voice crying out those exact words near the anniversary of her execution. It is a loop of perpetual confusion and fear, a consciousness trapped in its worst moment for eternity. Even the crown jewels are not safe from the uncanny. The keeper of the jewel house has reported that the alarms often malfunction in specific patterns that technicians cannot explain. Monitors show shadows moving across the vault when the room is hermetically sealed. Some speculate that the ancient stones in the crowns, diamonds and rubies with their own bloody histories of conquest and theft, carry their own curses, adding to the cacophony of spiritual noise in the fortress. The Tower of London is a layered cake of history, but the layers are made of bones and debris. Roman fortifications lie beneath the Norman stones. Who knows what pagan rituals were conducted on this hill before the conqueror arrived? The site may have been sacred or cursed long before the first dungeon was dug. This depth of history means that the hauntings are not just from the Tudor era. They are ancient, primal. In recent years, paranormal investigations have been allowed, albeit under strict supervision. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. Recordings captured in the White Tower have revealed whispers in Old English and Latin. One particularly chilling recording, captured near the execution block, seems to say, "Let me go," in a voice that sounds strained and breathless. Another, recorded in the Wakefield Tower, is a harsh or guttural growl that caused the investigative equipment to spike with electromagnetic interference. The skeptics will always say that the mind sees what it wants to see. They will say that the lighting is designed to be spooky, that the guides tell stories to prime your imagination. But how do you explain the police dogs? The tower is patrolled by security dogs trained to tackle armed intruders. Yet, handlers have reported that these fearless animals will refuse to enter the Salt Tower or the Beauchamp Tower. They will whine, tuck their tails, and drag their handlers away from empty corners. Animals do not know the history. They do not know who Anne Boleyn was. They react to presence. They react to threat. If a trained attack dog is terrified of an empty room, we must ask ourselves, what is in that room that we cannot see? As we wind down this investigation into the Nocturnal Ledger of the Tower, we are left with a disturbing picture. This is not a haunted house in a carnival. It is a repository of national trauma. It is a machine that was built to manufacture death, and it worked perfectly for centuries. The energy of that machine has not simply dissipated. It has soaked into the wood, the stone, and the soil. The next time you look at a picture of that white stone fortress sitting by the River Thames, remember what you are seeing. You are not looking at a museum. You are looking at a cage that captured the souls of the damned and the innocent alike. You are looking at a place where the line between the living and the dead is not a wall, but a veil, gossamer thin and constantly tearing. When the tourists leave and the gates are locked, and the fog rolls in off the black water of the Thames, the tower does not sleep. The sentries still walk their beats, both living and dead. The screams still echo in the sub-basements. The princes still reach for each other in the dark. And the headless queen still walks the green, waiting for a justice that will never come. The question you have to ask yourself is not whether you believe in ghosts. The question is, in a place with this much pain, how could there not be ghosts? Reality is fragile, and here it is broken. This has been an entry in the Nocturnal Ledger. Sleep well if you can. The past is never as far away as you think.